The morning Evelyn Rhodes stepped out of her black SUV on Maplewood Street. The whole block seemed to hold its breath. Her eyes swept across the row of modest homes and stopped on number 14, the garage. Paint peeling in long strips, the iron door streaked with rust, old cardboard boxes stacked against the outside wall. She turned to Mason Thorne and said it loud enough for the man crouching in the driveway to hear every syllable. "You call that a garage? It looks like a dump." Caleb Mercer slowly straightened. He didn't raise his voice. He met her eyes with a stillness that comes only from knowing exactly who you are, then turned and walked back inside. Don't look away, because what was hidden behind that rusted door was about to change everything. Maplewood Street had been the same for 40 years. The same maple trees arching over the sidewalk, the same faded welcome mats, the same neighbors who knew each other by first name and first cup of coffee. It was the kind of street that cities forget about until a developer decides it's exactly what they need. Number 14 sat near the end of the block. The house itself was neat, modest, but cared for. A small front yard with a rose bush that Claire had planted the year before Aria was born. A wooden fence that Caleb had repaired board by board the summer after the funeral. And the garage, 2 cars wide, facing the alley out back, with a door that had not been repainted since the previous owners left. Caleb Mercer stood in the side yard that Monday morning, a mug of black coffee wrapped in both hands, looking at the closed garage door the way some men look at a painting they have been working on for years. He was 38, with the kind of quiet face that makes people think he is either completely at peace or thinking about something very far away. Most of the time, it was both. He heard the back door bang open, and small feet hit the wooden porch steps. Aria came around the corner of the house in mismatched socks, her dark hair uncombed, one arm wrapped around cotton, the stuffed rabbit whose left ear had been resewn 3 times. She stopped beside her father, looked up at him, then looked at the garage. "Are you going in today?" she asked. "After I drop you off," he said. She nodded slowly, the way she always did when she was deciding whether to ask a follow-up question. Then, "Are you almost done?" Caleb looked down at her. He smiled, not a broad smile, just the small kind that lived at one corner of his mouth. "Getting there," he said. It was the same answer he had given her for 2 years. Aria had stopped pressing. She understood, in the way that children who have grown up too fast sometimes do, that there were things her father was allowed to keep to himself. By mid-morning, Diana Walsh had knocked on the front door. She was 62, lived 3 houses down, and had brought food to Caleb's door more times than either of them kept count of. That morning it was a loaf of banana bread, still warm. "Have you heard?" she said, holding the bread out and stepping inside without being fully invited, which was their arrangement. "Some development company. They're buying up the whole block, apparently, turning it into some kind of commercial complex." Caleb set the bread on the counter. "I heard." Diana looked at him. Then she looked toward the back of the house, toward the door that led to the garage. "Caleb," she said carefully, "if they come knocking." "I know," he said. "You don't seem worried." He turned back to the counter and picked up his mug. "I'm not." Diana stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, studying the side of his face. Then she sighed, patted his arm once, and left. She did not understand it. Most people on Maplewood did not understand Caleb Mercer. But Diana had long since decided that not understanding a person and trusting them were not mutually exclusive. 2 black SUVs arrived on Maplewood Street just after 3 in the afternoon, parking end to end at the top of the block, with the kind of coordinated precision that announced money before a single door opened. Evelyn Rhodes stepped out first. She was 36, with a face that had been described in business profiles as striking and in whispered conversations as intimidating, which were often the same thing depending on which side of a negotiating table you sat on. She wore a charcoal blazer over a pale blouse, her dark hair pinned up. She was already looking at her tablet before her heels touched the sidewalk. Behind her came Mason Thorne, 40 years old, hair combed back smooth, moving with the slightly too eager posture of a man who had spent a career being half a step behind someone more powerful than him and had learned to make that position feel like authority. He was the COO of Rhodes Development Group, and on a block like this, he moved like he already owned it. 4 of the 8 properties are signed, Mason said, walking alongside her. 2 more in discussion. That leaves the Hendersons at number 6. They're elderly. They'll come around in number 14. Evelyn did not respond. She was already looking ahead, cataloging. Number 14 is the problem, Mason continued. The owner won't take calls, won't respond to letters. We had one face-to-face attempt last month. He just said no and closed the door. They stopped at the low fence of number 14. The house looked fine, a little worn, but ordinary. The rosebush along the front walk, the repaired fence. Then Evelyn looked at the garage. The paint on the door had peeled away in long curling strips, exposing the gray metal underneath. A row of old motor oil containers was lined against the side wall. A set of rubber tires was stacked in the corner near the alley. A tarp, half folded, lay across a wooden pallet. From the street, it had the look of a space that had been ignored for a long time. Caleb was crouched at the gate latch, adjusting the hinge with a screwdriver. He wore an old blue t-shirt and work jeans, and there was a faint trace of something dark on the back of his left hand, not grime, something more precise, like a mark left by careful work. Evelyn turned to Mason. When she spoke, she did not bother to lower her voice. "You call that a garage? It looks like a dump." Then she looked directly at Caleb, and her voice carried the particular tone of a person who had corrected 100 problems on 100 properties. "You should be aware that the deterioration of a single property brings down the assessed value of the entire surrounding block." Caleb stood up slowly. He turned and looked at her, not with the flash of anger she might have expected, not with the defensive tightening of someone who knew they were being insulted. He looked at her with a stillness that had nothing of submission in it. It was the stillness of a man who had already decided, long ago, that other people's first impressions were not his responsibility. He said quietly and without heat, "You haven't seen the inside." Then he turned and walked to his front door and went inside. Mason snorted softly. Evelyn said nothing. Behind the living room curtain, Arya stood on the couch cushion with cotton tucked under her arm, watching. When her father came through the door, she asked, "Were those the people who want our house?" "Some of them," Caleb said. "What did the lady say?" "Something about the garage." Arya considered this. "She hasn't seen inside," she said. "No," he said. "She hasn't." Outside, Evelyn was already walking back toward the SUV, tablet in hand, running calculations on easements and acquisition timelines. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a single phrase had lodged itself and would not quite let go. "You haven't seen the inside." Mason returned alone the next morning. He dressed slightly more casually this time, no tie, collar open, which was his version of meeting people where they were. He had a proposal folder under one arm and the kind of smile that practiced itself in mirrors. Caleb answered the door in the same blue t-shirt. $220,000, Mason said, holding out the folder. "For the property and the lot. That is 50% above current assessed value, Mr. Mercer. Your neighbors thought that was quite reasonable." Caleb looked at the folder without touching it. "No, I understand it is a significant decision." "It is not," Caleb said. "No, is a short decision." Mason let the folder drop slightly. "Here is the practical reality. Every home on this block except yours has now been acquired or is in final negotiation. Within 6 months, construction on Meridian Square begins. You will be living next to a construction site. Your daughter will be fine," Caleb said. "Will grow up hearing jackhammers at 7 in the morning." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. He did not look angry. He looked the way a man looks at weather, aware of it, unbothered by it. "Thank you for the offer," he said. "Have a good morning." He closed the door. Mason stood on the porch for a moment, then turned and walked back to his car. On his way, he glanced once more at the garage. The peeling door, the stacked tires. He filed something away and drove off. That afternoon, Caleb picked Arya up from school. He could feel the looks from some of the other parents, the awkward glances that meant word had gotten around. A man named Gordon, who lived 2 blocks over, fell into step beside him at the gate. "They're offering good money, Caleb. I don't see what there is to hold out for." Caleb did not answer. He spotted Arya coming through the school doors, backpack bouncing, and raised his hand so she could find him in the crowd. On the walk home, Arya slipped her hand into his. "Is it true we might have to leave?" she asked. "No. How do you know?" He looked down at her. Because I said so. She seemed to consider this a satisfactory answer, which, coming from her father, it was. She squeezed his hand once and shifted Cotton further up under her other arm. That same night, in a hotel suite 2 miles away, Evelyn Rhodes sat at a desk reviewing the acquisition file on number 14. She had read most of it before. Property records. Mortgage history paid off entirely 4 years ago. Tax records current and clean. She turned to the employment section. Blank. Not incomplete. Blank. No employer of record for the past 9 years. No corporate affiliation. No business registration. Nothing. Self-employed, most likely, Mason had said earlier. Or insurance proceeds from the wife. Either way, it has no bearing on the acquisition. Evelyn had nodded. But she had not closed the file. She sat with it now, her reading glasses on, the cursor hovering over a search bar. The house was tidy. The man was composed. The garage looked like nothing. She closed the file, then opened it again. She had built a career on the premise that numbers did not lie. And the numbers in this file were telling her something was missing. Not wrong missing. There was a difference, and she had learned long ago to trust that distinction. Late that night, well after Arya had gone to bed, the light in the garage came on. A thin line of warm yellow pushed through the gap at the bottom of the iron door and fell across the concrete of the back alley. Inside, there were sounds, careful sounds, not the sounds of clutter being moved around, the soft scrape of a pencil on paper, the small, clean click of a measuring instrument finding its setting. A long exhale, the kind a man makes not from exhaustion but from satisfaction, the way a person breathes when something they have been building is finally starting to look like the thing they imagined. The light stayed on until well past midnight. Jackson Reed arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a dark green sedan that looked like it had spent most of its life in a corporate parking structure. He was 42, with the build of someone who had passed 20 years in engineering floors and conference rooms in roughly equal measure capable hands, sharp eyes, a posture that said he had delivered difficult news before and survived it. He and Caleb stood in the side yard. Jackson looked at the house, then at the garage, then back at Caleb. "You're still here," he said. "Still here," Caleb said. "I drove 4 hours. I appreciate it." Jackson rubbed the back of his neck. "Caleb, Harmon needs you, and I don't mean in the usual sense. They are standing at the edge of the largest licensing deal in the company's history, and the only person alive who understands the full architecture of what they're trying to finalize is you." Caleb held his coffee with both hands and said nothing. "Project Meridian," Jackson said. "The next generation chassis integration system. You designed the original prototype. You know every layer of it from the ground up. The team has been trying to reconstruct the foundation from the partial documentation you left behind, and they have lost 14 months and $22 million doing it. They have the files I gave them," Caleb said. Jackson looked at him steadily. "They have most of the files. The part that makes the whole thing actually work, the part you were still developing when you left, they do not have that." "A pause. It is in the garage," Jackson said. It was not a question. Caleb looked out toward the alley. "I left for a reason, Jackson. I know you did." Claire had been gone 3 months. Arya was 7 years old, and she had already lost her mother. She was not going to lose her father to a 70-hour work week. Jackson did not argue with that. He had the decency not to. "You are the best engineer I have ever worked with," he said quietly. "And I do not say that to pressure you. I say it because it is true, and I think you should hear it out loud once in a while." Caleb did not respond. He watched a sparrow land on the top of the fence and then leave again. The back door banged open. Arya came down the steps 2 at a time, stopped short when she saw the visitor, and looked him over with the frank assessment that only children and very experienced executives can pull off without embarrassment. "You're one of the people my dad used to work with," she said. Jackson crouched slightly to her level. "I am, Jackson Reed. Your dad and I worked together for a long time. Is he good at it?" "He is the best I have ever seen." Arya nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already known, then turned and went back into the house to finish whatever she had been doing. Jackson watched her go, then looked back at Caleb with something that might have been understanding, or envy, or both. "I am not asking you to come back," Jackson said. "I am asking you to finish what you started. Licensing deal. $200 million. 6 weeks of your time." He picked up a folder he had rested against the fence post. "And Caleb, the patent is still in your name. All of it. You left before anyone thought to argue about it." He held out the folder. Caleb did not take it. "I will think about it," he said. Jackson set the folder on top of the fence post and walked back to his car. Before he opened the door, he turned once more. "The world should see what you have been building in there," he said. "Not for me, not for Harmon. Just because it is remarkable." Caleb listened to the car pull away. He stood alone in the side yard, holding his mug. Then he turned and looked at the garage door. The rust on the iron caught the afternoon light and turned it a dull, quiet red. The accident happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after Jackson's visit. Evelyn's survey crew had been measuring the adjoining lot all morning, setting temporary scaffolding stakes along the property line. Just after 2 o'clock, a young technician lost his footing on the uneven ground and fell against a standing frame. The metal scaffold swung wide, came over the fence in a single lurching arc, and struck the side of the garage door with a sound like a gunshot. The impact rang through the neighborhood. Aria cried out from inside the house. Caleb was already moving. He came around the back at a run, checked on the technician, first shaken, not hurt, then turned to the garage. The door had buckled slightly inward on the lower right corner. He knelt down and checked the frame. Then he stood, unlocked the door, and pulled it open to check the interior. He had not planned for anyone to be standing behind him. But Evelyn was there. She had heard the impact from the street and come around the corner of the house at the same moment Caleb had. She was 3 steps behind him when the door swung open, and she saw everything. The light came first, a clean, steady wash of white LEDs mounted in 2 rows across the ceiling, illuminating a floor of polished concrete that held no stain, no crack, no sign of disorder. The air inside was cool and dry. There was no smell of rust or neglect. There was the faint, particular scent of machine oil and paper, and careful time the smell of a place where serious work had been happening for years. Against the left wall, 3 shapes sat in a row, each draped in a fitted gray cover. Caleb crossed to the nearest one and pulled the cover away in a single motion, the fabric falling in a clean fold to the floor. Beneath it was a 1966 Ford GT40 in Gulf livery, cobalt blue and orange. The paint so deep and exact that it looked like light was coming through it rather than reflecting off it. Every surface was original. Every trim piece aligned to a standard that had nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with mastery. The second cover came off, a 1970 1 Ferrari 365 GTB Daytona in deep Rosso Chiaro, the side mirrors still carrying the original factory adhesive under the chrome. The kind of car that auction houses spoke about in careful, hushed voices and then set records. The third car Caleb left covered. He stepped back, but Evelyn was already looking past the cars. Along the right wall was a workbench that stretched nearly the full length of the garage. On it, weighted down at the corners with steel blocks, lay sheets of technical drawings, not digital prints, but hand-rendered diagrams in graphite pencil, dense with dimension lines and section notations and the kind of marginal calculations that engineers write when they are working something out in real time. Above the bench, 2 monitors showed a 3-dimensional CAD model rotating slowly in a light gray field, a chassis system of extraordinary complexity. Every joint and load path labeled in precise, unhurried notation. And on the shelf above the monitors, a small collection of objects, a wristwatch with a competition dial, still in its presentation case, the kind given at engineering award ceremonies. A framed photograph, a woman standing beside the GT40 before it had been restored, laughing, her hand flat on the car's roof as if measuring the height of her happiness. And pinned directly to the wall beside the frame, in green and purple crayon, a drawing of 2 stick figures, one tall and one very small, standing next to a yellow shape with 4 wheels. Underneath, in uneven block letters, Dad and Dad, making car. Caleb stood in the center of the garage. He did not try to explain. He did not list what the cars were worth or describe what the designs represented. He simply let the room speak. Evelyn stood at the threshold. She had walked into difficult rooms her entire career, boardrooms, arbitration hearings, properties that had been misrepresented in every direction. She had never felt quite like this. There was a physical sensation of recalibration, as though the internal appraisal instrument that had been running continuous assessment since she arrived on Maplewood Street had simply stopped. "This is yours," she said. It came out less like a question and more like someone finding the right word in a foreign language. "Has been," Caleb said, "from the beginning." Mason appeared at the edge of the doorway behind Evelyn. He looked in. His expression moved through several things in rapid sequence: surprise, calculation, the first flicker of something that might have been concern, and then settled on careful neutrality. "We should go," he said quietly to Evelyn. She did not move for another few seconds. Then she stepped back, and the heavy door swung slowly closed. Caleb stood alone in the garage. He looked once more at the photograph on the shelf. Then he turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the monitors running the chassis model still rotating in its quiet gray field, patient and precise, waiting for whatever came next. Mason found Evelyn on the street outside, already back on her tablet. "Let us not overreact," he said. "I am not reacting," she said. "I am thinking." He could have borrowed those vehicles, stored them for a client. The drawings on the bench could be student work or reproduction prints. "They were not prints," Evelyn said. Mason paused. "You cannot know that from a 30-second look." She turned and faced him. "I know what original design work looks like, Mason. I have been in enough engineering offices. Those margins were not decorative. Those were working notes." She looked back toward the garage. "Call the valuation team. I want an assessment on vintage automobiles by tomorrow morning." "Evelyn." "Tomorrow morning," she said, and got into the SUV. As she turned to go, Arya appeared at the side gate. She was holding Cotton by one ear and looking at Evelyn with the unself-conscious directness that adults spend years trying to recover. "My dad made all of it himself," Arya said. "He did not buy the cars like that. They were broken. He fixed them." Evelyn looked at the small girl for a moment. "He fixed all of them?" "Every part," Arya said. "He showed me once. The orange one used to not have any insides." Then she turned and went back through the gate. Evelyn sat in the back of the SUV for most of the drive to the hotel, without saying anything. The tablet stayed closed on her lap. That night, she called a specialist she had used twice before for vintage automotive appraisals, a man in Chicago who charged accordingly and was worth it. She described each car. There was a pause before he spoke. "If the Gulf livery GT40 is as original as you are describing," he said, "we are talking about 4 to 6 million at international auction, conservatively. The Daytona, depending on the VIN and documentation, is potentially similar. But if the Miura S is matching numbers and in restored condition," another pause. "Miss Rhodes, a Miura S in that condition is one of fewer than 200 existing worldwide. 8 to 12 million would not surprise anyone in this market." Evelyn thanked him and sat very still. She opened her laptop and typed 2 words: Caleb Mercer. The first result was dated 5 years ago, an industry trade publication. The article confirmed, in careful corporate language, that he had been responsible for the complete architecture of Harman Automotive's H-Series platform, 3 consecutive award-winning vehicle lines, one of which had been recognized at the Geneva Motor Show. She read it again. Then she set the laptop aside and looked at the ceiling. In the morning, she went to Maplewood Street alone. No SUV, no Mason. She walked from the corner, carrying 2 cups of coffee from a place 3 blocks over that had been there since before either of them was born. Caleb answered the door before she knocked. He looked at the 2 cups. He looked at her. "I wanted to apologize for what I said," she began. "You described what you saw," he said. "There is nothing to apologize for." "Then I want to say I was wrong." He considered this. "You were incomplete," he said. "That is different." A small pause. "Can I see it properly?" she asked. Just properly this time. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to say no. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the back of the house. Inside the garage, with the lights on and no emergency driving the moment, she moved through the space the way she should have the first time. She stood for a long time in front of the GT40, close enough to see the surface of the paint, Not the surface of an amateur, but the invisible, perfected finish of someone who understood the material at a level most people never reach. She stopped in front of the workbench. "What is this?" she asked, looking at the rotating chassis on the monitor. "A project," he said. "What kind of project?" He was standing behind her, hands in his pockets. "The kind I have not decided to explain to anyone yet." She turned and looked at him not the way she had looked at him through the fence on Monday, when he had been a name on a property file and a problem to be managed. She looked at him the way a person looks when they are genuinely trying to understand someone rather than evaluate them. "How long have you been working on it?" she asked. 4 years, he said. "Give or take." She nodded slowly. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, the maple trees moved in a light wind, and a car passed on the main road, and number 14 on Maplewood Street held its quiet the way it always had, like something that had been waiting patiently for the right person to finally ask the right question. Mason Thorne spent the evening after the garage incident doing the thing he did best, which was finding the angle no one else was looking at. He recognized the GT40. He knew enough about classic automobiles to understand the rough scale of what was sitting in that garage, and that changed the calculation entirely. If Caleb Mercer had assets of that magnitude, the property negotiation was not a simple holdout by a sentimental homeowner. There was a reason Caleb had never moved, never negotiated, never come to the table. There was leverage somewhere that Caleb was either sitting on or waiting to use. Mason spent 3 days on the phone with a legal firm his office had worked with before on intellectual property matters. What they found was this. The patent registrations on file under Caleb Mercer's name contained a set of confirmed applications, but there were 5 additional designs that appeared in Harman Automotive's internal R&D archives, designs developed during Caleb's employment for which the formal assignment paperwork had never been completed before he walked out. The legal theory was thin, Mason knew that, but thin was sometimes enough to delay, disrupt, and discourage. The letter arrived at number 14 on a Friday morning. A courier knocked, handed Caleb an envelope, and left without waiting. Inside, a formal notice of intellectual property dispute, citing Caleb's employment agreement with Harman Automotive and claiming that 5 design architectures, including core components of what the letter called the Meridian Chassis Integration System, had been developed on company time and using company resources and were therefore subject to corporate ownership. The letter was signed by a partner at a law firm Mason used personally. The header did not include Rhodes Development Group, but Caleb read it once and understood exactly where it had originated. He set it on the kitchen table and went to make Arya's lunch. That evening, after Arya was in bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a folder he had kept in a fireproof box in the hall closet since the year he left Harman. He opened it. Inside was a collection of documents organized with the deliberate precision of someone who had anticipated this conversation, if not this exact moment. He read through each one, not anxiously the way a person reviews material they already know, checking that nothing has changed, confirming that the ground beneath them is still solid. It was. He picked up his phone and called Jackson Reed for the first time. Jackson answered on the second ring. "Someone is trying to claim the Meridian designs," Caleb said. A brief silence. "Who?" "A law firm, acting on behalf of someone with a reason to want me off this property." "Caleb, are your filings complete? All of them?" "Every one, including the 5 that were in progress when I left. I filed them independently, 14 weeks after I resigned, under my name as private inventor. The applications are confirmed. The grants are issued." Jackson exhaled slowly. "Then, they have nothing." "I know. But I need Harman to say that out loud in a room." "Consider it done," Jackson said. The following morning, in the Rhodes Development temporary office at the hotel, Evelyn opened the shared inbox she and Mason both used for acquisition correspondence. She found an email from a legal partner she did not recognize, copied to Mason's personal address, outlining a strategy for what was described as accelerating the number 14 clearance via intellectual property leverage. She read the email twice. Then she closed her laptop, walked down the hall, and knocked on Mason's door with 3 deliberate knocks. He opened it. He saw her face. "My office," she said. Now, whatever he had been about to say, he did not say it. The meeting was held at the Harman Automotive Regional Legal Office, 11 floors up in a building 12 blocks from Maplewood Street. The room held a long table, 8 chairs, and the particular silence of a space where serious disputes get resolved. Jackson Reed arrived first and arranged his own documents before anyone else came in. 2 attorneys from Harman's legal division took seats along the right wall. A representative from the patent office, present as a neutral observer at Jackson's request, sat at the far end. Mason arrived with his own counsel, a sharp-faced man in a charcoal suit who had settled 3 intellectual property disputes in the past year. Evelyn sat across the table from Mason, separate from his side of the room, in a way that had not been discussed, but was unmistakable to everyone present. Caleb came last. He wore a white dress shirt with no tie, and he carried a leather briefcase that was old enough to have lost its shine. He took the chair at the center of the table and set the briefcase down without opening it. He looked at no one in particular. He did not appear to be preparing himself. He appeared to already be prepared. Mason's attorney opened the presentation. He was thorough and spoke quickly. The core argument was this: 5 design architectures attributed to Caleb Mercer had been created during his tenure at Harman Automotive, using Harman resources within Harman facilities. The employment agreement, which the attorney now circulated, contained a standard assignment clause: all inventions created during employment, using company time or resources, were the intellectual property of the corporation. The exit process had been irregular. No formal transfer documentation had been completed. The patent applications filed by Caleb after his departure were therefore subject to dispute. The attorney sat down. The room turned toward Caleb. He reached into the briefcase and removed a document folio dark blue, the kind professional services firms use for final deliveries. He opened it and placed 3 items on the table in sequence, working slowly and without drama. The first item was a set of patent grant certificates from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, 17 in total, each one marked with the confirmation seal and issue date, each one bearing the name Caleb Mercer as sole inventor. The 5 applications in question were included. Their filing dates, all within 90 days of his resignation, were printed clearly in the upper right corner of each certificate. The second item was a copy of his original employment contract with Harman Automotive, tabbed at a specific clause on page 9. Mason's attorney leaned forward. The standard assignment clause was there, but below it, in a separately negotiated rider that had been added at Caleb's request when the contract was first signed, was a second clause: inventions developed independently after the conclusion of employment, using private resources, were the sole property of the inventor, regardless of subject matter or prior conceptual relationship to company projects. Caleb had asked for that rider on his first day. No one had objected, because no one had expected him to ever need it. The third item was a single printed email. It was dated 3 years ago, addressed to Caleb, sent from the account of the Chief Executive Officer of Harman Automotive. The email acknowledged Caleb's independent ownership of the Meridian chassis integration designs and proposed a formal licensing conversation at his earliest convenience. The room was quiet. Jackson spoke from the far end of the table. For the record, Harman Automotive has never authorized any third party to initiate intellectual property proceedings against Caleb Mercer on our behalf. We have no claim. We never had a claim. We have been attempting, for 3 years, to negotiate a licensing agreement with Mr. Mercer, which is the appropriate and only process. He looked at Mason when he said the last sentence. Mason said nothing. His attorney made a note on a legal pad and then stopped writing. Evelyn had not moved for the duration of the presentation. She looked at the 3 documents in the center of the table. She looked at Mason. Then she looked at Caleb. Caleb gathered the documents back into the folio, closed the briefcase, and stood. He buttoned the top button of his shirt. "I came here once," he said. His voice was level and without any performative weight. "I am not interested in extended proceedings. I have work to do." He picked up the briefcase. At the door, he paused, not for effect, but because he had one more thing to say, and he preferred to say it facing the room. "I have never kept anything from anyone who was entitled to it," he said. "I just never believed that loudness was proof of ownership." Then he left. Behind him, the room exhaled. 10 days later, Rhodes Development Group issued a revised master plan for the Meridian Square project. The redesign redistributed the footprint of the new commercial complex around the existing residential properties on the south side of Maplewood Street, rather than replacing them. Number 14 was not listed under any acquisition or clearance item. A reporter from the Regional Business Journal asked Evelyn Rhodes at a press briefing what had prompted the change in design scope. She paused for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that journalists notice and rarely understand the cause of, then said, "Sometimes you have to look at what is actually inside a space before you decide what to do with it." That evening, Caleb made pasta for dinner. Arya ate with Cotton, propped against the table leg, and told him about a school project on the life cycle of butterflies. He listened, asked the right questions, and refilled her glass of water without being asked. After dinner, he washed the dishes and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the back alley. Then he put on his jacket and went to the garage. He stood in front of the shelf where Claire's photograph sat. The woman in the photo was laughing the real kind, the kind that arrives before the camera is ready. Her hand was flat on the roof of the GT40, which at the time had been a gutted shell with no paint and no future. She had stood next to every version of every project he had ever taken on, not because she understood all of it technically, but because she understood him. He stood there for a while, not sad exactly, something more settled than that. A week after the meeting, the licensing agreement between Caleb Mercer and Harman Automotive was signed and notarized. The final figure was $230 million, $30 million above the number Jackson had originally named, after negotiations that had lasted 4 days and that Caleb had conducted himself, without a corporate attorney, from a folding table in a hotel conference room. The rights remained entirely his. The credit remained entirely his. Caleb did not celebrate. He sat alone in the garage that evening, in a chair he had moved next to the workbench, and looked at the photograph on the shelf for a long time. Then he stood, pulled the gray cover back over the GT40 with the same careful motion he always used, and turned off the lights. Then he heard small feet on the back steps. He turned. Arya stood at the garage door in her pajamas and socks, Cotton dangling from one hand, eyes wide and slightly ceremonial, as though she understood this was a visit that required a certain gravity. "Can I come in?" she asked. He opened the door wider and stepped back. She came in and stood in the center of the garage and turned slowly, taking in the whole space the way she had wanted to for years. She walked up to the Ferrari and touched it gently with one fingertip, the way you touch something you have wanted to touch for a long time and are not sure yet if it is real. "Which one did Mom like the most?" she asked. "She found the orange one," he said. "Before I did. She called me from a salvage yard in Ohio. Said she did not know what it was, but it looked important." Arya processed this. Then she moved to the shelf and looked at the photograph. She leaned into her father's arm. "I think she would have liked seeing it finished," Arya said. "I think so too," he said. On the Saturday morning that followed, Evelyn Rhodes appeared at number 14 without calling ahead. She was in jeans and a lightweight jacket, and she was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the same place 3 blocks over. Caleb came to the door, looked at the cups, and said nothing for a moment. Then he pushed the screen door open. They sat on the front steps. The maple trees along Maplewood Street were beginning to show the first pale green of new leaves. A dog barked somewhere and then went quiet. It was the kind of morning that had nothing to prove. "I owe you more than an apology," Evelyn said. "You do not owe me anything," he said. "You did what made sense with the information you had." She held her cup in both hands. "What comes next for you?" He looked out at the street, at the maple trees, at the fence he had rebuilt board by board. "I have been thinking about a new project," he said. "Something I have not been willing to start alone." She turned to look at him. "Tell me about it," she said. Inside the garage, the monitors were still running the chassis model rotating in its quiet light, patient as always, waiting for the next chapter to begin.